It was a crisp autumn morning when the peace that wrapped around Grandpa's 100-year-old ranch like a warm blanket was first disrupted. The air still held the scent of hay and old pine, and the rhythmic creak of the barn's weathered wood. Doors swinging in the breeze was as familiar as the sunrise. But that serenity was broken the day a white SUV rolled slowly down the gravel path, crunching the stones in a way that felt invasive, almost disrespectful. The SUV came to a stop, and out stepped a woman in pressed khakis and a pastel blouse, holding a clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge. Her sunglasses were oversized, her lips pursed with manufactured authority, and the badge clipped to her chest read, HOA Compliance Officer, Volunteer. Karen had arrived. The neighborhood had changed over the years. What used to be miles of farmland and open sky had slowly been replaced by rows of manicured lawns and sterile houses with identical shutters. A gated community had sprouted like weeds a mile down the road, and with it came the inevitable rise of the homeowners association, self-appointed rulers of property lines, paint colors, and mailbox heights. Though Grandpa's ranch predated all of it, it now sat just close enough to be within the HOA's sphere of influence, or so Karen believed. Karen had done her inspection. From a distance for weeks, she'd driven by, taken pictures from her car, and scribbled notes furiously into a leather-bound planner. To her, the old barn with its faded red panels and tilted weather vane was an eyesore, an offense to the meticulously maintained image she wanted for the area. It didn't matter to her that the barn had been built by hand by Grandpa's great-grandfather, nor did she care that inside it were artifacts of ranching history, worn saddles, and antique tools. All she saw was chipped paint, aging wood, and a structure she couldn't control. That morning, she stepped out of her SUV with purpose. Marching up the gravel path, clipboard clutched tight, she scanned the property like a border patrol agent. She barely looked at the horses grazing in the nearby field. She didn't notice the American flag flying high by the porch. Her eyes were locked on the barn like a heat-seeking missile. Grandpa was on the porch, sipping coffee in his flannel shirt and worn jeans, boots kicked up on the rail. His silver hair was combed neatly, and his eyes, though aged, were sharp. He watched her approach with calm interest, not moving from his seat. "Excuse me, sir," Karen began, her tone clipped. "I'm Karen Mullen with the Chestnut Hills Homeowners Association. I'm here to inform you that your structure over there," she gestured toward the barn with the tip of her pen, "is in violation of several aesthetic codes outlined in the community's bylaws. The paint is not in compliance. The structure appears unstable, and frankly, it brings down the visual standard we strive to uphold." Grandpa raised one eyebrow, took a slow sip of his coffee, replied in a steady voice, "That barn's been here since 1923. Built it with my granddad. Raised livestock in it. Fixed tractors in it. That structure's more stable than most of the vinyl boxes down the road." Karen stiffened. "That may be, but as a member of this residential community, you're subject to the same standards. You don't correct these violations, we'll be forced to escalate." Grandpa leaned forward slightly. "This isn't your community, ma'am. This land's been in my family for generations. That HOA you're waving around doesn't hold jurisdiction here." Karen wasn't listening. She scribbled a warning notice onto a pink sheet and clipped it to her board, her jaw tightening. Grandpa stood up slowly, walked to the edge of the porch, and looked her square in the eyes. "You picked the wrong barn to fight, lady." Karen turned and left without another word, tires spinning a little faster than necessary down the driveway. Grandpa didn't flinch. He just turned back to his coffee, took another sip, and waited for the next move. The next morning brought a stillness to the ranch that felt uneasy. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon, and a cool mist hung low over the fields. 8 birds chirped from the cottonwood trees lining the dirt road, but something about the air felt unsettled. Grandpa moved through his morning chores with the same routine he had followed for decades, feeding the horses, checking the fences, and brushing down the saddle he'd used since his youngest rode their first pony. Yet he could feel it, the presence of someone watching, waiting to act. By noon it came. Certified envelope arrived, left neatly in the mailbox with a bright orange sticker labeled urgent. The envelope was stamped with the HOAS seal, and inside was a 3-page notice typed, double-spaced, and loaded with legal phrases dressed up to look polite. Karen had followed through. The barn, she claimed, violated Article 7 of the HOA's Visual Uniformity Clause. She attached 3 photographs she had taken from the roadside and cited potential structural hazards and visible neglect. If Grandpa didn't comply within 15 days, she stated, the matter would be referred to the HOA Enforcement Subcommittee. Grandpa read the letter in full, then folded it and placed it on the kitchen counter beneath a cast-iron horseshoe. Nailed to the wall. He said nothing. Instead, he went outside, walked down to the barn, and stood in its doorway. He placed a hand on the grainy, time-worn wood, tracing the cracks with his fingers. Each scar in the wood told a story of storms weathered, animals sheltered, tools built and broken, and hands calloused by labor. That barn had never failed him. He wasn't about to fail it now. That evening, Karen returned, clipboard in hand, this time wearing a vest that looked vaguely official. Marched up the path again, only this time Grandpa met her halfway. His hat shaded his eyes, but his stance was direct. Squared up like a man ready for a confrontation he didn't ask for, but wouldn't shy away from. Mr. Granger, she said sharply, I'm here to follow up on the compliance notice we delivered this morning. Have you reviewed it? I read it, Grandpa replied. I suggest you read something 2 property lines and jurisdiction laws that barn's not under your HOA's control. It always has been county land, long before those gated fences ever went up. Karen's lips tightened. You're still within viewing distance of the neighborhood. Your structure impacts property values and the aesthetic cohesion of the surrounding environment. We've received multiple complaints. Tilted his head, eyes narrowing. Multiple, huh? Or just one from the same person driving back and forth with a camera? Karen's nostrils flared. We'll be conducting a safety inspection in 3 days. If your structure fails to meet compliance standards, further action will be taken. Without a warrant? Grandpa asked calmly. Karen blinked. This isn't a criminal matter. It's a civil enforcement. He gave a dry chuckle, turned, and began walking back toward the porch. Then you're going to be real disappointed when that inspection doesn't happen. I'm trying to help you avoid penalties, Karen said, her voice louder now. I suggest you cooperate. Stopped at the steps and turned around, his voice low and controlled. I've been building fences and repairing barns since your bylaws were scribbled into existence. You think a pink paper and a printed badge scare me? Karen didn't answer. She stood there flustered, watching him walk away. At that moment, the calmness with which he carried himself rattled her more than any argument could have. She had come expecting compliance, or at least confrontation. What she wasn't prepared for was resistance backed by quiet confidence, and a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be in control. As the sun dipped low behind the barn's aging roofline, silhouette bathed in golden light, Karen turned and made her way back to her SUV. Grandpa sat on the porch, watching her leave again. The letter still lay under the horseshoe inside, untouched since the morning, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. 3 days later, the ranch was quiet again. But a different kind of tension hung in the air when that even the horses seemed to sense. They stood still in the pasture, ears twitching toward the road, as if waiting for something unnatural to disturb their peace. Grandpa, as usual, was already up before dawn. He had shaved, dressed in a clean button-down shirt, sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee. The same way he had done on countless mornings before deployments, inspections, and battlefield. Briefing's old habits didn't die, they simply adapted. At exactly 9 a.m., a familiar white SUV rolled up the drive, but this time, it wasn't alone. 2 black and white patrol cars followed behind it, their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. Karen emerged from her vehicle looking triumphant, clipboard in hand, lips pursed in that self-satisfied way that suggested she thought she'd finally won. One officer stepped out of the first cruiser, younger, clean-shaven, with an uncertain expression. The second officer was older, more seasoned, his posture alert but relaxed. Karen marched up first, waving a folded document. We're here to perform a safety inspection under civil authority. This structure has been cited for multiple potential violations. Grandpa didn't stand. He calmly took another sip of coffee, then nodded once toward the officers. Gentlemen, he greeted them, ignoring Karen entirely. The younger officer stepped forward. "Sir, we're just here to make sure there's no immediate safety risk. We received a call from the HOA alleging potential structural instability and possible code violations." Karen cut in smugly. "Which gives us the right to enter and inspect. If he refuses, we can escalate it to the city." Grandpa stood slowly, setting his cup down with deliberate care on the porch rail. "This barn has stood 100 years. Built better than half the things you see going up these days. You want to inspect it? Bring a warrant, otherwise you're trespassing." The older officer stepped closer, eyeing Grandpa's face. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition. His voice dropped in tone. "Wait a minute, you're Granger. Lieutenant General Raymond Granger." Grandpa didn't react much, only offered a slight nod. The officer straightened. "Sir, my dad served under you in Desert Storm, talked about you every day growing up." Karen looked baffled. "Lieutenant what?" "I'm sorry, what does that have to do with anything?" Young officer now looked visibly uncomfortable. "Lieutenant General? You're a 3-star general?" Grandpa didn't boast. He never had. 2. He simply looked at the barn and said, "That structure's lasted longer than half the commands I've given. And I promise you it's sound. You can check with the county if you want. Historical registry paperwork was filed in '98. Been protected ever since." The older officer turned to Karen, his demeanor shifting. "Ma'am, if this property is outside HOA jurisdiction and it's protected by historical registry, you have no authority here." Karen's face flushed red. "I was told this barn is clearly unsafe. I don't care about whatever rank he claims to be. The building is an eyesore, and he's refusing to comply." The officer shook his head. "He's not claiming anything. He is a lieutenant general. I'd advise you not to push this." Grandpa stepped off the porch, slowly walking toward them. "I've fought for this country, led men through war zones. I've never backed down from someone with a clipboard." Karen's lips quivered, unsure whether to argue or retreat. The moment of authority she had envisioned slipped through her fingers like dust. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The officers turned and walked back to their cars without further discussion. Karen stood alone in the gravel, the wind. Catching her neatly stacked papers and scattering them across the drive, she didn't chase them. She only watched Grandpa, who bent down, picked up a loose sheet, and handed it to her with the faintest hint of a smile. "Next time, ma'am," he said quietly, "do your homework." The news traveled faster than wildfire in a dry summer. By sundown, nearly everyone in the neighborhood had heard about what happened at the Granger Ranch. Word of the standoff between the HOA Queen Bee and the retired Lieutenant General spread. Through social media groups, text threads, and front porch conversations like gossip, laced with admiration. People who'd never even met Grandpa before were suddenly talking about him like he was a local legend. And in truth, he was. But Grandpa didn't care about attention. The next day, he was up early again, sweeping the porch, checking the irrigation, and rubbing down his saddle. He moved with the same calm precision he always did, as if yesterday's confrontation had barely scratched his awareness. But those who knew him well, especially his granddaughter Lily, who often visited on weekends, could sense a shift in his posture, slight tightening of the shoulders, a readiness in his eyes. Not of anger, but of resolve. Karen, meanwhile, was reeling. She had strutted up to the ranch, thinking she was about to put an end to what she saw as a blight on the community. Instead, she left humiliated, overruled by uniformed officers who'd shown more respect to the rancher than she could comprehend. She hadn't expected her authority to be questioned, let alone dismantled by someone who didn't yell, didn't threaten, but simply stood his ground with a history she hadn't bothered to research later that day. An emergency HOA meeting was convened. Karen stormed in, flustered but still trying to maintain her grip on control. "This man is undermining our ability to maintain standards," she snapped. "He's dangerous, intimidates people." One of the other board members raised a skeptical brow. "Did he raise his voice?" "No." "Threaten you?" "No," Karen admitted reluctantly. "Then how exactly did he intimidate you?" Karen hesitated, unable to answer. The silence in the room stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, another voice chimed in from the back of the room, an older resident who had served in the Navy years ago. "I met the man once." He's not the problem. You are. The room grew tense. Karen shot him a glare. Excuse me? You embarrassed us? The veteran continued. You called the cops on a decorated war hero over a barn that stood longer than any of us have lived here. That barn's part of the landscape. It's more authentic than those plastic picket fences half the residents build just to impress each other. Karen stood speechless, caught off guard for the second time in 2 days. And now the crowd wasn't behind her. People began to murmur in agreement. Few even suggested issuing a public apology. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Grandpa received a quiet visit from the older officer who had recognized him. The man brought coffee and a newspaper clipping from 1992 featuring Grandpa. Receiving the Distinguished Service Medal, he shook Grandpa's hand with the reverence of someone meeting a lifelong mentor. They talked for over an hour on the porch. About old missions, the soldiers they both knew, and how strange civilian life could be after decades of discipline. By the next morning, a letter arrived from the county office officially confirming that Grandpa's barn was, indeed, a protected, historic structure. Not only was it exempt from HOA interference, but any further attempts to interfere with its preservation would be considered harassment under state historical protection laws. The letter was posted right next to the barn's entrance, laminated and framed by Lily herself. Karen passed by that week, but didn't stop. She didn't even glance toward the ranch. She'd finally realized she wasn't going to win this fight, not against the law, not against the community, and certainly not against a man who'd commanded troops, earned medals, and survived war zones without flinching. Respect, it turned out, couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. The neighborhood slowly began to return to normal, but the atmosphere had changed. The one subtle divide between the older rural residents and the newer suburban transplants had become more apparent. With Grandpa Granger's barn standing firmly at the center of it, all both physically and symbolically. The ranch had always been there, a quiet relic of another time, but now it held a new kind of authority.
House.
People began driving by, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Some even stopped at the edge of the gravel drive to take pictures of the old wooden structure. With its hand-forged hinges, century-old roof beams, and sun-bleached red paint, Karen had vanished from public view. After the failed inspection and the fallout from the emergency HOA meeting, she quietly stepped down from her self-appointed enforcement role. No official announcement was made. She simply stopped showing up at meetings, and the once-weekly HOA compliance reminders stopped appearing in mailboxes. In her place, the board appointed a quieter, more reasonable neighbor named Mr. Collins, a retired teacher who believed in communication over confrontation. When asked about the barn, Collins merely chuckled and said, "Some things are better left alone, especially if they're stronger and older than you." Despite everything, Grandpa didn't gloat. He didn't rub his victory in anyone's face. He didn't post online or talk about what happened at the feed store or diner in town. Just kept going, mucking out stalls, patching fences, and stacking hay as though nothing had happened at all. But there was a subtle shift. He began receiving visitors more frequently. Some were neighbors who had never spoken to him before. Others were veterans who heard about what happened and wanted to shake his hand. One afternoon, a young boy from the HOA neighborhood arrived with his father, both shy and uncertain. The boy was doing a school project on local history and asked if he could interview Grandpa. About the barn, Grandpa agreed. He brought out a few old photos from an antique cigar box, sepia-tone pictures of his grandfather and father building the structure by hand, one plank at a time. He told the boy how the barn once housed 8 horses, 3 cattle, and a dozen chickens. How it survived hailstorms and twisters. How he'd fixed its roof himself after a lightning strike in '79. The boy listened with wide eyes, jotting notes furiously. At the end of the visit, Grandpa handed him an old, rusted horseshoe and said, "This fell off my first colt when I was your age. Might bring you some luck." That interaction sparked something. More kids came by. Parents followed. The barn became a living piece of history, not just a structure. Grandpa began giving small weekend tours. Nothing formal, just storytelling. And strong coffee. Lily helped organize the visits, creating simple flyers and a binder of old photos. She even added a plaque near the barn's entrance that read Granger Ranch Barn EST, 1923. Preserved with honor. Karen never returned. Rumor had it she sold her house and moved across town. Her name faded from neighborhood chats and board meetings. Some said she simply couldn't handle the embarrassment. Others believed the HOA gently encouraged her to step back. Either way, her absence was welcomed with quiet relief. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting a golden hue across the fields, Grandpa sat on his porch, boots propped up, watching the barn glow in the fading light. A light breeze stirred the weathered wind vane on top, the same one that had spun for 100 years. He sipped his